Welcome to the Gem Lab video tutorials, where I'm going to give you some basic step-by-step guidance on the ins and outs of video editing so you can get started or get a refresher on something when you need it. In this tutorial, we're going to touch on exporting files from Premiere, using either Premiere itself or Media Encoder, as well as going over what you need to know about video formats, codecs, and some suggested settings. In Premiere, you can either export sequences, which is about 99% of what you'll be doing, or you can also export source clips and subclips from the project window. This can be useful if you need to send someone a selection from a longer clip or need to bring in short clips for some sort of presentation. To export from a clip in the project window, right-click the clip in question and select Export Media near the bottom of the list. Note that you will have to tell it to respect your in and out points if you set them underneath the image preview in the bottom left by changing the Source Range drop-down to Clip In Out. The more common thing you'll be doing is exporting sequences, different cuts of your videos to get feedback from people, review them in other contexts, etc. It can also be useful when you're getting close to completing a video essay or documentary, time permitting, to export the latest version of your piece, take an afternoon or day off from editing it, and watch it outside of your editing software. This can enable you to notice things about your cuts and rhythm that you won't be able to detect when your attention is split between watching the timeline, the audio meters, and the program viewer in your editing software. Take note of what you think you might want to change based on this experience, and also try to watch it on a large screen if you intend to distribute it that way, as the effects of the cuts and montage will be different in that context. To export from a sequence, simply make sure it is open in the timeline and the timeline window is selected, as delineated by the blue highlight on its window. Then either hit Ctrl-M on PC, Command-M on Mac, or go to File, Export, Media to open the export window. I will note that you should make sure a couple things are correct before you go on with this menu. First, check that your in and out points are set correctly in your timeline, as you could end up only exporting a small section of your sequence, or you could end up with a whole bunch of blank space at the end of your sequence if you left some clips far off at the end of your timeline while you were working. If you forgot how to use in and out points, please check the card in this video to go to that section of a previous tutorial. Second, check your visibility, mute, and solo controls on your tracks. If you left video tracks disabled, they will not be exported. Likewise, if you left tracks muted, they will not be exported either. However, if you soloed one track, then the rest won't be exported, only that track. This is how you end up with a mimetic trailer like the one for The Mummy 2017, which was uploaded with only the dialogue tracks active.
Pan, this is November 4, 09er 9er.
More on mute and solo in this card for a previous tutorial. Now we get back to the export window. This is broken up into preview, scaling and range on the left side, and the settings panel on the right. On the left side, you'll see a preview of the content being exported. At the top, there is a choice of how to scale if you are changing its resolution. Generally, you want to leave this on scale to fit. Below this, you'll see a bar that shows what portion of the timeline or clip is being exported. This is important to check as it will tell you if your in and out points are being respected. Then you can use the source range drop-down to make sure it says sequence in out or clip in out if you're exporting a clip. If you need to change the ins and outs, I highly suggest that you back out of this menu and set them on the timeline or in the source viewer, as it is much more precise than trying to use this interface. Now, before moving to the right side, I need to explain a few basic concepts about video compression. If you already know about video compression, skip to the timecode below. Okay, so these are pretty technical, but we're going to try and go through these basics in as expedient a manner as possible. Point 1. Video files consist of both a container, i.e. MP4, MOV, MXF, AVI, etc., and a codec, H.264, H.265, ProRes, DNX HD, MPEG-2, etc. Point 2. Containers sometimes determine what programs or devices will accept the file and how it is recognized. The codec, on the other hand, determines how the actual data in the file is written. Sometimes devices are more strict, like a TV or set-top box, which will most likely only play or recognize H.264 video in an MP4 container, and nothing else, as opposed to VLC on a computer, which will play most but not all containers and codecs. Point 3. Different codecs have different purposes. We'll break this down into professional, specialty, and delivery codecs. Professional codecs like ProRes, DNx HD, and others are built to be high-quality codecs that preserve visual quality and work harmoniously with editing software. They can also be popular when used to create masters of your work, high-quality, visually identical but slightly compressed playable versions of your sequence. Masters in these formats are of sufficient quality that you can convert them to new formats without significant quality loss, meaning if your Premiere file is lost, you can make new conversions without having to access it. Most computers and devices do not come with these codecs pre-installed. They are installed when you install your editing software, or you may have to look them up like drivers. VLC may work to play these on most computers. Then there are professional mastering and delivery codecs, DPX, DCP, Cinema DNG in some cases. These are high-end cinema-oriented codecs that export the audio and video separately as frames and audio. These are the highest quality type of master you can have, but they're also really only designed to be played in cinemas or with very high-end software. That brings us to specialty codecs, Apple Animation, Uncompressed API, and others. These are also meant to be professional, but they're meant for specific uses. These specifically are used because they support transparent video and maintain complete visual quality. You would not want to use this to export an entire sequence because that would be really inefficient, but when exporting motion graphics, animated titles, or effects, they're very useful. Lastly, there are normal delivery codecs, H.264, H.265, also known as HEVC. These are codecs that you want to use when uploading to websites or generally when bringing a video file that you want to know will work on most video systems. These are not made to be visually perfect, but they are made to be flexible in order to balance file size and quality, so they require a bit more thought into what settings you use to get that balance the way that you want it. We're going to focus on H.264 as H.265 is a newer codec which is not globally supported at the time of this recording as we continue on in the next steps. Now welcome back to those of you who skipped ahead, and with that covered, here are some suggested settings I can offer you. First, we're going to look at making a master, which is surprisingly a bit easier in terms of using this menu than making an upload quality version. Mostly because the codecs for this purpose have different versions with specifically mandated settings, so there ends up being very little for you to tinker with past choosing which version of the codec to use. If you want a bit more information on, for instance, ProRes, we covered that in a previous tutorial. First, we're going to select QuickTime from the Format drop-down menu. Then we're going to go to the Preset drop-down menu, where we're going to choose a flavor of Apple ProRes. You can see on screen some suggestions depending on the type of content you are editing. Each step up in quality will come with a significant file size increase. Then click on the blue part of the output name and set the name and location of where you'd like to save the final file. Given that this is a master, I would suggest that you save it to your final exports folder if you're following our organization method from a previous tutorial. Make sure that both the video and audio export boxes are ticked. Then, as a safety measure, you should hit Match Source to make sure your export is not changing your frame rate or your resolution. For ProRes, as I said, the rest of the settings here will be grayed out as they are largely predetermined. The one thing that you can look at, which is optional, is maximum render quality. If you resized any of your footage or used any graphics created in Premiere, this will increase your render time but will also greatly improve the quality of these effects. In general, it will actually take much less time to render out a master than an H.264 file, but how long that actually takes will depend on your hardware. You can then hit either Q or Export, which will start the exporting process, but I'm going to explain that after we explain the H.264 settings. Looking at H.264, the most common upload delivery format, it does a lot of things to reduce file size, which is why it's heavily used in online video as it's very efficient, but it is also very intense for your computer to write. We start the same way. Select H.264 from the Format drop-down menu. Then, in the Preset drop-down menu, select either Vimeo or YouTube 1080p Full HD, depending on what service you may use. I still recommend using this even if you're making a file to watch on your computer or set-top box, because then you can just upload it later without making another version. Then click the blue portion of the output name to set the name and location of the file, and make sure that both video and audio are enabled with the checkboxes. Again, hit Match Source to make sure all of your sequence settings are respected. Then we're going to scroll down to bitrate settings. You'll see some suggested settings on screen, and I'll give you a bit of an explanation of how to choose from these. A big part of the space-saving qualities of H.264 is VBR, Variable Bitrate Encoding, which is designed to use less data to encode simple frames with little movement and visual change, and more data for complex shots with lots of movement and visual change. The first part of VBR is the bitrate encoding setting. This determines how many times your computer will read and evaluate each frame of your video in order to properly allocate the smaller and larger amounts of data. VBR1 does an okay job, whereas VBR2 is significantly better because it looks at every frame twice. However, this does come at the cost of very increased, possibly doubled render time depending on your equipment. Then you have to tell Premiere what your target bitrate, or average amount of data per second you want to stick to is, and your maximum bitrate, or the amount of extra data it can dedicate to complex frames. Generally speaking, the more data, the nicer the result, but also the larger the file. The maximum should always be higher than the target by at least 2. And if you know the bitrate of your source footage, there's generally no point in heavily exceeding that number, even if you're going for a very high quality result. As you change these values, the estimated file size will update in the bottom of this window. So you can adjust things to fit within an upload cap, like the 500GB maximum on free Vimeo accounts. But note the files tend to come out a little bit larger or smaller than that estimate, so I would always leave a little bit of headroom. The other large part of H.264 is keyframe distance under advanced settings, which dictates frame compression. The simple explanation is that to save space, video compression alternates between saving the full data in your frame and using algorithms to save partial frames. The basic explanation of how this works is it will write an iframe, which contains all the data from a frame, and then it will alternate between writing P frames and B frames, which both contain only partial information. It will alternate between those until it's told to write another iframe, which contains all the information, thereby saving space. This saves a lot of data, but it can really mess with the quality of dynamic imagery, especially things like sports, high-speed footage, experimental editing, and hand-drawn animation. By default, this is set to 90 frames between your full iframes, which is incredibly efficient and is fine for most things, but it's not the highest fidelity. If you have very dynamic content or animation and you find that your exports are lackluster, I would suggest reducing this to make it equal to your frame rate, so that at least once a second there's a full frame encoded. For really demanding cases, you can drop this to half your frame rate even. This can increase your file size, however, in a way that won't be directly shown in the file size estimate. Then lastly, you can hit maximum render quality to increase the rendering of resizing and graphics made in Premiere in the final export. Once all of these settings and decisions are made, you can choose to export or to queue. So returning to this, export will make the file through Premiere. It will lock up your ability to use Premiere until it's done, showing you just a progress bar, and it will be a bit more demanding on your system resources in my experience, as Premiere already uses a fair bit of them just to run. Queue will send the file to Media Encoder and open that software, which offers a few advantages. For one, while exporting using Media Encoder, you can continue to use Premiere, assuming you have a good enough computer, of course, and Media Encoder will just slow down its work when Premiere needs the resources. You can also queue multiple exports in Media Encoder. For instance, if you want to export a file at multiple quality levels, or you want to export the full file and then a section to put up on social media, and you can have them automatically export one after another in a batch without you having to watch it. Lastly, I find Media Encoder to be a bit more efficient overall as a program, meaning slightly faster exports, and while bugs aren't that common in exports in either of these programs, they are even less likely in Encoder from my experience. It is always suggested that if you are exporting the final version of a piece that you're going to exhibit somewhere or show, that you watch the entire file afterwards to make sure there aren't any bugs in the encoding, or that you didn't get Mummy 2017. I hope that you found this tutorial helpful. If you did, give it a like or subscribe to the channel to see new tutorials we put out, and best of luck with all your editing projects.